23 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the eastern suburb of Lichtenberg continues to grapple with a checkered past. Blue-collar suburb, headquarters of the hated secret police, and today a showcase of malaise. But in the midst of it all, a ray of hope. An organization calling itself Sotsdir has moved into the neighborhood. Under the auspices of the Lutheran Church, it has embraced a long-term program of renewal, employing and training young people and accomplishing extraordinary change. It's part of an overall concept for revitalizing Lichtenberg. Sotsdir has established 30 separate locations in the district, including youth clubs, daycare centers, job training facilities and family counseling programs. It's all the brainchild of Michael Heinisch. In 1985, he became a deacon at the local church, taking responsibility for young people who were branded misfits in communist East German society. That task made him an undesirable as well.
I've always been involved in the church. I was raised in it as the son of a pastor. My father's a minister in Frankfurt Oder on the Polish border. When I was growing up, I wanted to do something completely different with my life, and I remember telling my father I didn't want to be a pastor, so I remained a deacon.
Heinisch is a people person who easily gains the trust of those he meets. A powerful and useful trait when dealing with society's outcasts, and for raising badly needed funds.
We reach out to problem cases. We work with them to shape a vision of the future and the steps we must take together to make it a reality.
Heinisch believes everyone has the ability to shape their own destiny. Some just need more support than others. He gives us a tour of the place where it all began in 1985. Young outcasts came to this church seeking protection from the all-powerful state.
I saw it at first as an opportunity to teach God's love, but that didn't work very well with punks and skinheads, so it became a process of listening and establishing dialogue. I paid attention to them. They eventually began listening to me. It worked, and they accepted me as part of their world, their parallel reality.
The East German authorities had zero tolerance for the misfits. Skinheads and punks were banished from youth clubs and driven out of public places. So they found refuge in churches. The secret police branded them as enemies of the state. The churches were also frowned upon. But the peaceful dissent nurtured inside these houses of God would eventually play a major role in bringing an end to communist tyranny. Initially, many parishioners also disapproved of the often offensive punks, and Heinisch encountered increasing resistance from within his own congregation.
I had the keys to the church property. I allowed them to enter, and then they stayed a while. At some point, I had to tell them they couldn't remain. It's a different matter than going to the church leadership and saying, "Hey, I have an idea for a social event in 4 months' time." There was no way I could get approval to let them stay.
Heated debates erupted as church members grappled with the vexing issue of what to do with the young outcasts. Some wanted to deny them refuge. Church leaders were at their wits' end. But Heinisch was on familiar footing with the young people. In many cases, he knew their families as well.
That was over 20 years ago, but most of them came from the big, newly built apartment complexes. Many of those were reserved as domiciles for employees of the secret police, the Stasi. These punks were their children. The sprawling residential complexes were constructed in the early 70s, and 2 decades later, a lot of adolescents were running around. Most of the teenagers I came in contact with were born and raised in the city, and some had formed an extreme right-wing political orientation.
After the wall fell, young people were still drawn to the churches. Even with the demise of communism, society still looked upon them as outcasts. Heinisch was one of the few exceptions. He welcomed them all, punks on Mondays, skinheads on Tuesdays. Wednesdays were reserved for the hard rock crowd.
It's important not to judge young people by their outward appearance. You have to get to know each person as an individual. Once I began interacting with them from that point of view, accepting them as individuals, I could always find some kind of redeeming value. As a Christian, I'd call it lovable.
As the post-communist era began, these former outcasts were eager to test the outer limits of their newfound freedom. They squatted in abandoned, decaying buildings. Authorities initially reacted with extreme measures, but the young rebels remained steadfast.
There were lots of illegally occupied homes on this street. During winter, the squatters started fires in the stairwells to stay warm. They did the same thing under the rooftops until they used up everything that would catch fire. They burned everything they could find until the buildings were empty shells. So we moved into the street ourselves and decided to renovate one of the apartment buildings.
Heinisch is not one to play favorites. He gave support to young people no matter their political leanings. His goal was to get them working together in a community project and thereby slowly pull them back into society with viable prospects for the future.
These young people grew up here. They were raised in this concrete jungle. For them, it symbolizes the concrete society of former East Germany with all its tensions. I believe society owes a debt to these young people. It has the duty to offer them hope. They didn't grow up on the fringes of society. They were in the very midst of it.
Since the wall fell, Heinisch has dedicated himself to help those outcasts find a place in society, to give them opportunities and instruction suited to their needs and abilities. He has a novel way of determining those needs by asking at the source.
On this very wall, I once met 3 or 4 young people, all drinking beer from bottles. It was an East German brand, and they were speaking Russian. So I took a look around and then approached them. I asked them if they knew of a place nearby that would make a cool location for a meeting place for young people. They pointed at the tunnel and said they were squatting there. They would gather there in the evening, start a fire, get a party going, until the authorities broke things up. The kids had no alternative. And I looked around again and realized they were right. This was a cool location, a former pedestrian tunnel.
The old tunnel and kiosk had long been closed down and were in a state of advanced decay. But the kids found a secret entry and turned it into a hangout. Salzstier saw possibilities in the structure, and soon development began on a new underground project. Heinisch convinced city officials of its efficiency. Then the fundraising began, the search for sponsors. Finally, construction plans were finalized and bureaucratic hurdles were overcome. Heike Hinz is an architect and volunteered to draw up the blueprints.
We got the young people involved from the very start, and they performed most of the labor. The demolition work was done on weekends, and they painted the finished structure as well. That's very important because in the end it's their club. Things have worked out well.
The club has been a resounding success, attracting adolescents from the entire neighborhood. And young people make good use of the opportunities provided, organizing concerts and shows, making new friends, and taking part in workshops. There's also an experienced social worker on hand to discuss personal problems and look for solutions.
Gut, vielen Dank. Kommst du nachher nochmal wieder und ruf mal an. Soll ich das schon mal hier behalten? Nein. Okay. Letztendlich kommen hier alle Jugendlichen her, die...
Young people from all over the neighborhood meet here because they want to spend time with their friends and do something meaningful with their time. They also like the attractive atmosphere, and sometimes it's just a place to meet new people. So they come here. But those who have things on their minds, perhaps serious problems or concerns, know they can also find help here. It's a broad spectrum, everything from cultural offerings to advice and support.
I enjoy making music with people. I record it and use it on the beatbox with my little brother.
Für Deutschland. Berlin. Lichtenberg. Kommt her. Guckt euch an, was hier abgeht. Ich habe Durst. Nur für euch.
This is the perfect way to raise their awareness of the church. I always say that faith-based social work is effective from a religious point of view. This is our window on the world, and the world's window on the church. We're right in the middle of things, face to face.
But the Tube offers far more than leisure activities. Patrons also put their own ideas and innovations to work. Socdia provides financial support for a wide variety of projects.
Thankfully, Germany is a prosperous nation. Even here in Lichtenberg, the poverty level doesn't really compare with the misery you see in other countries. Anyone who's traveled abroad knows that we truly do have an amazing standard of living. But the problem in Lichtenberg is a very large education gap. It's not that there is a lack of opportunity for training. It's simply that in many cases, people lack the essential learning and competencies to make use of those opportunities.
Heinisch and the Socdia Foundation place great importance on caring for and providing opportunities for children.
15 years ago, the district decided to close all daycare centers, leaving no alternatives. At the time, there were 2 city-run kindergartens, but no privately run centers. There was a good reason for that. The leased buildings were in a state of disrepair. They still used coal stoves for heat and had no outdoor play areas for the kids. That was the way things were in former East Germany.
These prefabricated concrete structures were standard fare in the East Germany of the 1970s. But the dreams of a socialist workers' paradise were not to be, and now the buildings are falling into disrepair.
The big prefab kindergartens were really nothing to write home about. It was the building code of the 1970s. There is still one that's in its original condition. The roofs and windows leak, and the walls are rife with hazardous materials. We have to remove and dispose of it when we refurbish the buildings, and they're not exactly energy efficient.
Heike Hinz lives and works with her team in the district she has adopted as her home. After the wall fell, she quickly joined up with the Socdia group and began restoring buildings and structures, including the Tube. Her designs are spawned from a uniform concept.
As I mentioned, we are passionate about the choice of colors. It is a very important consideration. The concrete high-rises and apartment complexes that surround us tend toward pastels. So we like to accentuate our projects so that they stand out a bit. I have no desire to be a famous architect. My overriding goal is for the young people to notice something striking on a street corner, a place where they can meet. And for commuters, it should be a landmark as they drive along.
The apartment blocks along this street were condemned. No one was interested in them, aside from the squatters. But Hinz developed a vastly different vision for the neighborhood.
It didn't strike me as chaotic. Of course, I was in my mid-20s at the time. I saw it as a challenge and an opportunity. This was a place where I could really make a difference. I'm a West Berliner. I grew up in an urban environment. But here, I felt I could breathe. I thought, this is how I want to live, in a friendly neighborhood where people know each other.
Those friendships are facilitated in part by the high percentage of young people growing up here. Closure of the 2 public kindergartens forced the parents to mobilize. They discovered a building with plenty of room, and throughout they received abundant support from Sotsdia.
Losing a kindergarten is catastrophic for a neighborhood like this. We were trying to bring this district back to life one building at a time, once we'd taken care of the squatters' needs. But then suddenly the children didn't have a kindergarten around the corner. It doesn't work that way. Children provide cohesion in a neighborhood.
Sotsdia provided funding to buy this building. The parents got involved in the renovation process, along with Sotsdia's own masons and carpenters. Along with innovative interior design, it was soon a functioning daycare center. The furniture was produced in Sotsdia's own carpentry shop, made by trainees. Heike Hinz took responsibility for the interior. After all, her children are enrolled here too.
I truly believe that tasteful architecture and charming surroundings have a profound effect on child development. They are happy to be here, and that is important to me.
The children seem to enjoy their kindergarten. That in turn benefits the entire neighborhood. Parents are relieved that their kids are being properly cared for, and there's plenty of space to play. The Sotsdia kindergarten is organized so that parents and caregivers work together in partnership. The goal is for children to develop into independent, creative adults. Heinisch is again on the road. He'll attend a meeting with local politicians to lobby for his foundation.
I constantly talk with children, young people, and families that tell me their troubles. And these problems are caused, for the most part, by social factors. In political circles, I can relate those experiences and tell officials the stories I've heard, how children, young people, and families are getting along.
Markus Heffner is one of the many who credit Sotsdia with giving new direction and meaning to life. After a turbulent youth, he underwent carpentry training. Now he has set his sights on making something of himself.
Ist ihr vorher ausgehobelt? Stimmt das hier? Das Ausmaß?
I was into drugs. I tried about anything that came along, and my life was in a downward spiral. I got involved in crime. But at some point I thought it was time to clean up my act and find my place in the world. After 2 years of work and training here, I feel really good about myself.
A new generation of young people is making use of the services provided by Socdstia. Many of their parents are former squatters. Life in the district is slowly but surely changing for the better. But there is still much to be done. Sadly, in many cases, Socdstia is often seen as a last resort.
It's important to remember that many of those who turn to us are on probation. We often accompany young people to court and provide support if they're sentenced to day-release jail terms. At first, the judges say, "Oh, here comes another social worker. I've heard it all before." Therefore, it's important that a senior construction worker explain that the suspect is a trainee and is actually doing well, and I already have him scheduled to work at a building site. Usually the judge will show leniency and hand down probation as a sentence.
The young trainees are involved in every part of the decision-making process. They even came up with a name for the workshop: Hirnholz, cross-grain.
Hirnholz has to do with the tree rings you can count. It's the piece of wood that is the most difficult to work with. It must always be well protected from the elements so that water can't seep into it. Cross-grain is always a tough customer.
Michael Heinisch first recruited troubled youths to refurbish this building in the early 1990s. Out back was a decrepit old dairy barn. At the time, no one in their right minds could have believed that it would one day be home to a grand training facility for chefs and restaurant personnel. Today, it would be hard to imagine anything different. Disadvantaged young people undergo worthwhile training here with good opportunities to enter the job market. The teachers know what they're talking about, and the head chef knows firsthand how it feels for adolescents to gain a feeling of independence and pride. He was once a squatter here himself, a punk, an outcast, who left his native Bavaria for Berlin.
There were lots of punks here. Anarchists, punks, hippies, you name it. Everyone was a cast-off from society. This was like our own little world.
That little world has changed dramatically. Long-time residents, former squatters and new arrivals have contributed to a unique cross-section, a mini melting pot. And the trainee restaurant, Am Kuhgraben, is a popular meeting place for the locals.
Hat Ihnen denn geschmeckt? Haben Sie sonst noch einen Wunsch?
It's all the brainchild of Michael Heinisch. As a deacon, he's a man of the cloth. But often the Christian aspect of his work goes unnoticed.
The church has a difficult time of it in the east, whether it's East Berlin or in the surrounding countryside of Brandenburg. We live here in a secular, separate environment. In this district, only 8% of residents identify themselves as Christian. On the other hand, 8% equals 70,000 people. That's a fair number.
Yet another Socdstia showcase. An ambitious garden project, contributing further to the rejuvenation of the Lichtenberg district. Most people choose to live here because the cost of living is inexpensive. Most don't have a lot of cash. Many are unemployed or work in low-wage jobs. Many are immigrants, and age-old animosities sometimes come boiling to the surface.
We encourage people to make contact with those from different cultures, to get to know each other, do some gardening together, perhaps find a sense of place, to plant roots, so to speak. That's true of refugees and others who've just arrived here, and of course Germans who are new to Berlin. We try to combat loneliness, get people out of their apartments and socialize a bit, get to know people. You can learn a lot.
I planted the seeds right where you told me to, where the sign was.
Salzstier has leased the land and allows anyone to take a plot and do with it what they will. But after all that work, there's time for play as well. Salzstier street festivals are hugely popular. The foundation opens its facilities to all those who want to make use of them. Its ultimate aim is to create a livable cultural community, a wholesome atmosphere for children, young adults and families. A society firmly grounded in a Christian worldview. Michael Heinisch is back on the road, energetically pursuing his personal vision of bringing the Lichtenberg district back to life.